Welcome to the Conservation Tribe. I'm your host, Blane Edwards, aka Earth Offline, and today we are talking about African vultures. So this is an animal that doesn't receive a lot of love in the public eye, which is unfortunate because A, they're pretty awesome, and B, many of the vulture species are in fact endangered or critically endangered and need all the help and awareness that they can get. So to talk about this further, we are joined by today's guest, Will Donald, a fellow conservationist and also co-founder of Toucan Conservation. So, Will, cheers for coming on the show, mate, and welcome to the Conservation Tribe.
Thank you very much, Blane. Happy to be here. It's going to be fantastic to chat with you today.
I am genuinely looking forward to it. So let's begin with an intro. How about you tell everyone a wee bit about who you are and what you do?
Okay, so my name is Will Donald. I am co-founder of Toucan Conservation. I'm a current master's student at UCL, studying biodiversity, evolution and conservation, and my research focuses for my masters are on painted dogs and African bird species. I've had about a year and a half experience in South Africa, Zambia and Zimbabwe, working with wildlife organizations on the ground to see how they conserve wildlife.
Okay.
Effectively.
Yeah. So you're finishing your degree. You're still finished in the end part of your degree.
Yeah, so I'm currently doing my master's, and then after that, I'm going to be going on to do a PhD as well. So my plan is to do 2 years of African field work after my master's, and then go into a PhD.
Very fancy. Do you know what your PhD topic's got to be on?
Well, I'm currently thinking about doing it on painted dogs because that's the species that I've focused most on for my masters and the species that I know the most about. And they are the most endangered carnivore besides vultures in Africa. So I want my PhD to be focused on a species where it's actually going to have some benefit to the conservation of that species.
So those two animals are actually the most endangered.
The most endangered large carnivores, yeah.
Right, yeah. Jesus, spitting out the facts already. So what inspired you to get in this space?
Into conservation, pretty much. It's quite a bit of a cliche, really. I was 8 years old. I remember it really well. 8 years old, 2004, and there's a documentary by the BBC called Big Cat Week. Mm-hmm. And Big Cat Week was a show that was based in the Masai Mara, and it was three conservationists going out and following a pride of lions, a family of leopards, and a family of cheetahs. And they do it they go out and record for 3 months and get this week-long footage of this show. And I watched it and I was transfixed, and it completely sold me. And I was 8 years old, and I was like, that is what I want to do for the rest of my life. And so my parents at the time were like, yeah, okay, he's gonna forget about that. He'll be fine. He'll change that up. But I haven't. Over the last 15 years now, I've just been conservation, just thinking about how I can get out to Africa and work with wildlife.
I love that story. It's awesome that you can pinpoint it to a documentary, a couple of hours in your life. You can point this is a moment that has inspired what I want to do for the rest of my life. Exactly.
And so one of the presenters on that show was a man called Jonathan Scott, who he works with cheetahs in the Masai Mara. I saw him when I was 8, and luckily one of my family friends was really good friends with Jonathan Scott. So I got to actually meet him when I was 10 at a lecture, and he said to me at this lecture, "I'm so amazed that you're 10 years old and you want to work with wildlife. Good luck with it all." And so that has also stuck with me as well. And so then a second time I actually went and met him again when I was 17, and he was much more interested in the younger cohort, obviously, as I was. But his words really stuck with me. Go out, don't let anyone else tell you can't do it, and just go out and follow your dreams. And that's stuck with me for the last 13 years. So
I think that's good advice. Stick with your guns, follow your gut, follow your dreams. We live in a world where, with the power of the internet, we can, for the most part, we can do whatever we want to do as long as we couple that ambition with hard work. We have the tools at our disposal to do these things. So go out there, give it a crack. If you fail, doesn't matter. retry and.
Exactly. You're the only person who can know whether or not you can make it or not. Effectively, if that makes sense. You have your dream, and you are the only one to know whether or not you can pursue that and get that dream or not, and go to do something else. So you can't let anyone else. They can give you advice, but ultimately it comes down to what you want to do. And if you want to go out and work in conservation, you go out and work in conservation, and you go out and work out what the best route in to go and work in conservation is, which is what I'm currently doing, and then pursue it because if you love it, you will get there.
If you love it, you put in the hard work as well. It's definitely important.
Exactly.
So toucan conservation. So you're obviously very passionate about the space, and I guess naturally you've wanted to start up your own project, which is toucan conservation. So do you want to talk a little bit about what that is and kind of what that stands for?
Yes, okay, of course. That was quite a funny way to say it. But so toucan conservation its aim is to bridge the gap between science-based conservation and the general public. So Angelo and I, who are the two co-founders, we met a year ago in a game reserve in South Africa because we were both working for this organization that was monitoring predator populations, lions, leopards, cheetahs in this game reserve. And we were thinking, we've never seen like a documentary or a factual or like a wildlife video about, the wildlife organizations on the ground that are doing conservation work. There are hundreds and hundreds of conservation organizations out there that are putting in hard hours to conserve Africa's wildlife, to conserve America's wildlife, to conserve the world's wildlife. And we hadn't seen anything like this. And so we wanted to create this platform, this idea, this effectively this video service to highlight the work that these conservation organizations do to get as many people into conservation as possible to see how, so they can see what goes on the ground.
So the ultimate objective is to inspire more conservationists.
Correct. Get as many people watching conservation so they can want to go into conservation and help conservation. And
you believe video is a great medium in order to convey those messages.
Yeah, exactly. I genuinely do, because people will see an article and they'll see, it's got 1,000-word article, and we think, I don't want to read that. I've got the time to read that. But if they see a 5-minute video on this is how to save the painted dog, this is how to save the African elephant, and it's got like loads of, they're bombarded with information over a 5-minute period about how these species are conserved on the ground. I genuinely think people will more like to watch that and get excited. They get to see all the cool footage of the animal in its environment, and they get educated along the way. Because all the nature documentaries that we see out there, they're all either really long and really well made, but they're all like hours long. They're like 55, 40 minutes long. And they so the BBC, the Natural Geographics, they create these amazing videos, but they don't quite have the reach that a 5-minute video on YouTube would get, I reckon.
No.
In terms of conservation.
No. Well, where they post that documentary, it's not on these social platforms, so that in itself removes that shareability aspect. It removes that possibility for it to go viral online because you can't share it. And yeah, also the length as well, you need to consider. Like, we as humans have in my opinion, a diminishing attention span, and you almost have to grab their attention within a few seconds, realistically. You almost have to grab their attention in the thumbnail. So you have half a second to grab their attention, or else they won't even click on the video in the first place. So you could have all the best information in the world about lion conservation, painted dog conservation. But the crazy thing is, if you can't grab their attention in the thumbnail, they may not click on it in the first place, and there's a missed opportunity.
Exactly. Like, for instance, our videos that we've started uploading to YouTube, I'm exactly on that point with you. All our videos have got, because we're doing painted dogs at the moment, that's our focus species. They're all of a painted dog in its environment interacting with something. Because people will think, oh, that's exciting. It's a painted dog. It's an animal that's quite cute. I might click on that video. Then I'll watch, it's only 5 minutes long. So I'll watch it and I will learn something about the species that I didn't know 5 minutes ago. So that's what we're trying to get into.
Okay. So video, the medium is video, which I am a big believer in. And the focus on getting behind the scenes footage and supporting the people that do on the ground work, that are the unsung heroes, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that's super important, is because sharing those stories, definitely inspires people like me. It inspires anyone. And I feel like conservation is maybe something where they don't tell those stories enough. So if you can fill that gap, then I think that's definitely, there's a lot of value in that for sure.
Exactly.
Yeah. And good networking
Well,
as well.
There's a reason why, you know, the National Geographic and the BBC and other organizations are starting to upload 5 minutes of footage to their YouTube channels. You know, you can go online and you can just type in like cheetah hunt, and you'll come up. The BBC will be the first things that comes up, and it'll be 3 cheetahs hunting an ostrich, and it's 2 minutes long, and that's a clip from their whole interview. But you get aspirin narrating over the top of it, but you don't actually learn. All you learn is what's going on in that particular moment. You don't know, you know, how are those cheetahs existing in that environment? What are the man hours that are going in order to protect that environment, so that those cheetahs can go and hunt that ostrich. And so that's what we want to show in our videos that is different to these organizations.
Yeah, and I think it's only a matter of time before they eventually do that. Like the amount of time invested and money invested into creating these large-scale documentaries, to come out with a product that's only a couple of hours, like obviously that couple of hours is bloody good, but there's so much content there that they can repurpose into smaller clips for social media, into articles, into podcasts. There's just so much more. There's so much content there that they're not sharing with the world, which is unfortunate. Like from one documentary alone, you could probably extract micro pieces of content for a year's worth of social media, pretty much. Absolutely, I would definitely agree with that. Like you can collect, you know, my filmmate, you said to me, you said you do roughly about an hour's footage for a minute of video. So they could create, you know, they've got thousands and thousands of hours of footage, but it's all of the animals themselves and very little of it of the work that goes on to protect those animals. There almost needs to be a documentary about the documentary.
Correct. And that's why, you know, that's why the BBC now, you know, they have their hour-long slot of their documentary, and then 45 minutes is of what's going on in the documentary, and then 15 minutes at the end is how did they film this documentary. They throw that in there at the end to try and get people interested in filmography. But they're not showing as well, they're not showing how those areas are conserved. They're just showing how they went and filmed it.
I'd love if there was a documentary on the different roles of the people that are involved in these documentaries. I'd love a documentary or a video on how they edit the videos, or how they shoot the videos, kind of what settings, who they interview, like the conservationists that they interview, the tour guides. They could do a documentary on every single role. I don't understand why they don't do that, because it's just so insightful. There's at least, you know, I would be interested in that, in watching a documentary on how the person edits the video of, you know, Planet Earth. I'd find that interesting, and if I find it interesting, thousands and thousands of other people would find it interesting, and you can target those people on social media. Anyway, I'm pretty big on social media because I think it's very powerful. So I'm always looking for ways that we can do conservation better.
Exactly.
Even though I'm not a traditional conservationist, but I'm someone that cares.
What would you define a traditional conservationist as?
I guess in the broad sense, someone that has got a formal qualification in a related field.
So that is a current conservationist. The traditional conservationists of the 70s, the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you know, the George Adamsons, the Tony Fitzjohns, they went out. They were just normal people who went out and tried to go into conserve wildlife. Like the first guys that ever released lions into Tanzania and Kenya. Like the guy was he worked in a builder's shop, and then he decided to go out and travel Africa, and he was at the right place at the right time, and then he's been there for 60 years or whatever it is. Like the traditional role of conservationists. Well, if you go back like 150 years or 200 years to when the first Europeans went over, all the conservationists weren't conservationists at all in these days. They were actually hunters, and so they were going out and conserving loads of areas of land so they could go and shoot things. And then since then it's become from those days, it's now become going out and conserving the wildlife. But the formal qualification stuff, that only really started to kick off in the 80s and the 90s. Okay. So over the last 40 years.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, because, like I mentioned before we started recording, me going to architecture school, being an architect, and always having this interest in the natural world, but not really knowing how I wanted to pursue it. But I think one mission with this podcast is I want to connect with a range of different conservationists, from experts to students to creatives, innovators, anyone essentially that is working towards the same goal. And I think that's really important, because the moment you close off certain conservationists, you're just reducing the potential for us to work together and do good. So I think, we're all important. Even the ones that don't necessarily have a formal qualification like myself.
Well, you said, a formal qualification is a degree, right? So you're you got an architect's degree, is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so you could go out, hypothetically, to somewhere in Africa as an architect and teach people how to build properly. And then that could then benefit conservation in that way. You could teach, going out and teaching people to have a valuable skill, and then they would not go out and poach things. That's the mindset that people, if they want to go and work in conservation in these areas, you don't have to have everyone's got a science degree, but a science degree doesn't help conservation unless you can do something with it. And because there's so few jobs and so many people trying to get into it, that a science degree nowadays hasn't got the same weight as it used to. But if you've got a transferable skill, if you can go out and build houses, if you can go out and build fences, if you can go and fix Land Rovers, you can go to Africa and you can go and work in a position as a mechanic, or you could go and train people up as mechanics and get jobs like that. And then that is a role that people can play in order to conserve a particular area. Like a research camp cannot function without an onboard mechanic, a person who's there the whole time who can fix cars, a person who can fix radios, a person who can fix, like Wi-Fi signal is huge nowadays in Africa. Like, because you can go out in the bush and you can be 12 hours from the nearest town, but you still have Wi-Fi because you can still contact people. And you can do that because that's the way in Africa works. You carry around your Wi-Fi thing with you, and you've got Wi-Fi on the whole time. If that breaks, you can't contact anyone, because people are then becoming over reliant on these devices, and they're actually requiring people to be on site who can actually fix them. So
that's a problem.
In terms of conservation, like having a degree in a field that will help someone in conservation in Africa is really beneficial. It doesn't have to be science-based.
Yeah, I think I agree. Obviously, the science base is super, super important, but there is more to the picture than that.
Yeah.
So quickly on that, before we dive into the more vulture-specific stuff, how would you define a conservationist?
How would I define a conservationist?
In your opinion.
Well, a conservationist is anyone in any sort of world, in any sort of like profession, anything like that, who has a passion for the environment and wants to help save it. Like they can be simple. They might have never had any qualification in anything, but they like, my granddad, for instance, loves birds and wants to protect his garden. He's a conservationist.
Yeah.
He wants to feed his birds. He's a conservationist. And so, a conservationist, like I said, is someone who is passionate about the environment and wants to help save it.
Okay, then what's the difference between a conservationist and environmentalist?
Not very much.
Much of a muchness.
Like, it's terminology. So,
yeah.
How like an environmentalist, I don't know. So, can you define an environmentalist to me? Would it be the similar situation?
Well, I don't really know, but from my understanding, like it's much of a muchness, like you said. They're more or less the same thing. But environmentalists, they try and tackle the bigger picture issues. So I'd say climate change and that kind of stuff, where conservationists, their focus is more specific. Conserving a species or an an ecosystem, but that obviously in order to conserve this ecosystem, you need
10 years ago, I would agree with you there.
Yeah.
Because very recently, conservation has moved away from conserving one species and to conserving entire ecosystems.
Yeah.
So I'm actually thinking a conservationist and environmentalist are pretty much intertwined. It's just what they want to call themselves.
Yeah.
You know, I reckon that an environmentalist wants to call themselves an environmentalist because they love trees and they love saving the climate. And a conservationist wants to call himself a conservationist because he wants to work in an ecosystem. He wants to work in the ecosystem and conserve it in his own way.
Mm-hmm.
Something like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on to vultures. The amazing vultures.
Yeah. Vultures excite me. They really do, because they don't get any positive light at all, really. No one knows anything about them, and if they do know stuff about them, they think they're grotty. They think they all they eat is dead things, and they don't really do that much. You know, as the average person, they think, oh, vultures are a bit dirty. You know, they all they do is hang around dead animals and stuff like that.
Yeah. So why are these? So these are misconceptions.
These are, well, you know, they're not.
They do hang around dead bodies, but
they hang around dead bodies, but they play such a fundamental role to the ecosystem, and they are incredibly clean.
Mm-hmm.
Like the role of a vulture is to eat dead things to clean up the environment. That's what vultures do. Vultures will see. Well, they'll get a huge flock of vultures that will fly overhead, and they'll be looking out for dead carcasses. When they see a dead carcass, they'll all fly down and they'll eat it. And then that means that dead carcass doesn't have, it's eaten within a couple of days. So that doesn't rot. It doesn't produce. It doesn't have loads of food left out in the environment that's rotting away, so that diseases can come into the environment. They're a control of the ecosystem. If vultures go extinct, then there'll be carcasses littered everywhere, and something else will fill that gap. So something else will fill that gap and eat all of that meat. And so what's going to fill that gap? Well, it's most likely going to be stuff like stray dogs, stuff like stray cats. If it's outside of an environment, if it's inside an ecosystem, it's going to be other scavengers such as lions and hyenas, which will have a very detrimental effect overall to the ecosystem. And it's without vultures, ecosystems could collapse.
Okay, so so that's the ecological role, and you said that if they went extinct, another animal would try and fulfill that role, let's say a lion, and you said that would be negative to the ecosystem.
Yes.
How would that be negative to the ecosystem?
So if there are dead carcasses everywhere, they're going to spend a lot more time scavenging, because there's food everywhere. They're more likely to get diseases because the food's going to be rotting, because lions and hyenas will eat rotten food if it's available, because it's easier to eat than, say, going out and catching an animal, because it's very, very energetically costly to go out and catch an animal, whereas it's very, very easy to go and just scavenge across like an elephant carcass, for instance. And so if they won't be hunting it as often, so prey populations will probably increase, and then that will be detrimental to the plant species in the area. And then B, they're more likely to get diseases, which means they're more likely to die. And then because there's fewer of them, prey populations will increase, and then the vegetation will decrease, and so the ecosystem will go completely out of flux. And so it will be very detrimental overall. Because if the habitat goes beyond repair, if prey populations increase too much, and the habitat gets reduced in quality too far, the point of no return, then the prey populations will decrease, but the foliage won't increase again. And so the ecosystem, the food web will have fewer individuals overall as a result.
So there is like a critical point where there is a point of no return when talking about this kind of stuff.
Yes. We don't know what that point is.
Okay, that was going to be my next question. Can you measure that?
We don't know what the point is until we've experienced it, and we haven't experienced it yet. In wide scale, that is. You do experience it sometimes on game reserves in South Africa, because game reserves in South Africa are all really fenced in, and so they're completely fenced. So the game doesn't have the opportunity to move out, and so they populate and they populate and they populate, they breed and breed and breed, and so there's too many of them, and then they just destroy all the foliage inside, and so and then they all crash. So you see it on very small scales in stuff like game reserves in South Africa, but this would happen wide scale across all of the ecosystems in Africa if vultures went extinct.
Fascinating. Yeah, I think it's hard for people that don't go to uni studying this kind of like zoology, biology, or conservation. It's hard for them to appreciate just how intricate that balance is of an ecosystem and how it's like a spider web. Once you know, the tiniest touch of the spider web will ripple through the whole thing. And I feel like that is an accurate kind of analogy. It is just a delicate balance, and the removal of some species or any kind of change can have drastic consequences.
Exactly. And I think as well, like, people understand that you need to conserve lions, you need to conserve elephants because they're keystone individuals to the ecosystem. They put out a lot more than they put in because they regulate that. So they put out a lot more than they take. So they will monitor they will monitor the ecosystem, and they will what's the word I'm looking for? They will control it. Well, vultures play an as critical role to the ecosystem as lions do, as elephants do, as leopards do, as hyenas do. They all play a vital role. And if you remove one thing, if you remove one species out of that, if you remove elephants or you remove lions or you remove vultures, then the ecosystem will just completely go out of flux, as we said, and it could collapse.
How do we articulate the severity of that? How can we present that in a way that is digestible to the everyday person? Because to us, it's just like, how can we do that? But to the everyday person, they're like, I don't see how that's a big deal. Like, how do we make them care about it?
That's a good question, actually. I was going to say there's a very good video on YouTube, again, videos in social media of, you might have seen it, about the wolves in Yellowstone, reintroducing wolves into Yellowstone National Park. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that video?
I haven't seen it, but I've read about it.
Okay. So wolf populations were reduced completely in Yellowstone National Park. They were completely wiped out. And then the whole park is all about how introducing wolves changes rivers. So the wolves were wiped out. The antelope came in, the deers, and they completely destroyed the habitat. Then they reintroduced wolves, and then the antelope moved away from the rivers. Vegetation grew again, and then rivers moved, and they completely changed their course. Rather than going straight down, they actually meandered. And so this video that came out, it's got millions of views, 5 minutes long, very digestible. People can watch it, and then they think, oh, that's fantastic. We can see that. We can see the effect of this conservation, of the reintroduction of these top order predators into the ecosystem, and see how that can just create much more natural beauty compared to what it was before. In terms of getting the average person to care about this stuff, it's very, very difficult to get someone who doesn't care to care. If they are not on the fence, if they do not care, you're not going to persuade those people. But from my view, is to get the people who are on the fence, who are not, I wouldn't say ignorant, but like they don't know as much about it, but they're kind of like animals, they're not too sure about it. And then you say to them, you show them all this information, you share it to them, and you say, this is what, we need to conserve these areas in the same way that we want to conserve stuff in the UK, in Australia, New Zealand. Because I know New Zealand's got a huge problem with invasive species, for instance, that you're trying to get, New Zealanders are trying to get their, get everyone to understand what invasives are and how bad they are for the environment. It's a similar sort of situation. You've got to say to people that if these things go extinct, we have caused that and we need to do something about it. And then I think you could get people to on board with that. If you say it's our fault that this has happened, let's fix it, then people are more likely to go for it.
I've been thinking about this idea a lot the last probably month or two about what actually informs our decisions and why do we do what we do. This is getting quite philosophical, but I'm pretty philosophical kind of bloke. But why do we do the things that we do? And if I'm wanting to convince you to do something differently, how do I do that? And I reckon it comes down to people do things because they think that they will gain more pleasure from doing that than if they didn't do that. It's like a selfish perspective. And I think things like conservation and climate change and all these things, the only way that they will change their mind is if guilt is one thing, But you need to convince them that it is better for them to go down this route than if they didn't go down this route. And I think guilt is a card that you can play, because if they're feeling guilty enough, if their guilty outweighs their selfish desires, then they'll change their mind, because it isn't a pleasurable experience being guilty. But at the end of the day, you're trying to be net positive in pleasure, and you need to convince their selfish gene that it's beneficial for them to do it. Otherwise, I don't actually think people will change. So education's one thing, but you need to educate them in a way that makes them understand that this is actually a good thing for me to do.
People, I think, yes, again, philosophically, I think people are inherently selfish. They're in for it for themselves. And if you can get them, as you said, if you can get them to think that it benefits them to conserve these animals, if there's a way that you can do that, then that's how you got to change people. But I completely agree with you there.
And I agree. I think inherently we are selfish beings, but on that, I think thinking about the collective well-being or the collective health of, species and ecosystems, if we take that mindset, we selfishly will be better off. So kind of in like a contradiction, like an ironic kind of way, the less selfish you are, the more you will receive in return, if that makes sense. Like the more that I care about the environment, and the more I care about how rhinos and elephants, how I can increase their quality of life, or how I can increase the rainforest's quality of life and all the organisms within it. If I adopt a mindset of caring about those things, in the long run, I will actually be better off for it. So it's selfish to not be selfish.
Yeah, it's selfish to be almost selfless. Like people do things because it makes them feel good. If you want to, you like, not saying you, but like if you want to go out and not have palm oil products in your food because it makes you feel like you're making a difference, because it makes you feel good. So, but that's, again, you got to have that mindset for people. You got to be able to persuade people to think that it will make them feel good to save the environment.
Like a lot of these environmental trends at the moment are the trends, and people hop on board because they may genuinely care about the environment. They may genuinely care about reducing the plastic that goes into the oceans. But a lot of them are just doing it because it's a cool thing to do. Which kind of goes back to my previous point about why they do it in the first place, because they're getting something from it. They're doing it because they will be perceived as this, this person doing the right thing, and they'll get that kind of cool status. It's that
like
social status.
Virtual signaling almost. Like they want to show other people that they're doing the right thing and to get other people to do that for them. So I sort of get that, yeah. And I'm not saying,
but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's negative.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's negative because it's what it is, and I would agree that that's actually quite a good thing. You want to show people. You want to show people that this is the way to conserve the environment. It makes me feel good. Come and feel good with me. If that makes sense. Like come and enjoy protecting the environment and get something selfish that's beneficial for you out of it.
And the thing is, once they kind of go down that route, they will probably, their mindset will shift to one where it's like, I do genuinely care. Like I started this because I thought it was cool, but now I actually give a shit.
Now an eco warrior.
And I think that's like the natural progression. Like I know a lot of people that have, like my mate that I did the very first podcast with, he is obsessed with elephants now. Like that's his whole life, is ensuring that, he's like an advocate for them. But when he first worked at an elephant sanctuary, like many moons ago, 5 years ago, or whatever, he didn't have that interest. It was just a random job that he saw online, and he was like, this will be a cool experience. And since then, he's now become like this elephant advocate. And it's that once you get your foot in the door, even if it's to be kind of hop on a bandwagon, you can become a converter. You can be converted in the process, which is,
and then become a converter. Yeah,
and then you become deep rooted in the cause. yeah, I'm fascinated with. I want to make conservation cool, and because it being cool is a way to get people's foot in the door. You know, just to taste it. If they think it's cool, they'll taste it and they'll see. And not all of them will be fully converted, but I think a portion of them will. So I think that's important. Conservation needs to be cool. It needs to be cool. So how do you make it cool?
Exactly.
Yeah. That's my thesis, and that's something that I'm working on. Seems to be a quite
Mr.
a bit
Philosophy.
more complex than I originally anticipated. It's a big thing.
Yes, well, yes, conservation is extremely complex, and people don't get that really. They don't understand how difficult it is to conserve environments and everything that goes into it. And so, again, that's why Angela and I are starting up Toucan to try and get people to understand that.
Yeah.
But that's like inherently as well. Angela and I are doing Toucan because we get to learn stuff. We get to learn. Well, I've learned so much about the painted dog over the last 3 months. Our next species is either going to be giraffes or hyenas or cheetahs, something like that. I'm going to learn so much about those species, and then I'll learn how to conserve them, and then I'll be able to share that information with people and make conservation cool, as you said, make people interested and get into it.
Mm-hmm. When you do a podcast, every single time you do a new species, I reckon that should be a thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how many species of vultures are there in the world?
So you've got to think, when you think about vulture populations and species, you've got to first classify them into 2 groups. You've got the New World vultures, which live in America, so North America, South America, which actually, so you've got the black, I think that's the black vulture. The California condor is actually involved in the vulture family as well on that side. And then in the Old World, Africa and Asia, you've got 16 species of vultures. Of those 16 species, 10 live in Africa. And of those 10, 6 are endemic. They only live in Africa. So there are, and those 10 species are, you've got the 2 largest species, as in largest populations, are the hooded vulture and the white-backed vulture. There's about 200,000 of those. Then the largest in size, the lappet-faced vulture. Then you got the white-headed vulture, the Egyptian vulture, the Cape vulture, the griffin vulture, the palm nut vulture, and a couple of others I can't remember the names of. And all of those vultures, again, are apart from one, are all carnivorous and all scavengers. So they all. So in terms of science, in terms of interest, how does 10 species of a genus all play in the same role, accessing the same ecological niche? How do they all coexist? Because they all should be competing with each other, surely. If they're all playing the same role, they should be competing. Now, the way they've got around it is they've all got different size heads and different size beaks. So the largest ones have massive beaks, which allows them to open up carcasses that are dead and access all the large bits of meat. And the smallest ones have very small beaks, so they can access all the little tiny nooks and crannies, like
other ones can't access.
Yeah, so like the hooded vulture is about 1/3 of the size of the lappet-faced vulture, but they all eat at the same time around the carcass.
Yeah,
and that's how a carcass gets completely cleaned. There's no meat left on them because they all play that role. And so again, if you lose one of those species out of the 10, then it can completely mess things up. And we're definitely going down that route. So of the 10 species in Africa, 6 of them, I think, are either critically or normally endangered. So they've all declined by at least 80% over the last, or 50% or 80% over the last 3 generations.
3 generations being how long?
Yeah, 3 generations. So the way the ranking for an endangered species works is it's based either over 10 years or over 3 generations, whatever is longer. And vulture species, because they are so long-lasting lived, their generation length is about 20 years. So it's actually over about 60 years, they've declined by 62% overall, and some species have declined by about 90%. Now, that sounds like a long time, but you've got to remember that vultures breed incredibly slowly. They breed once every 2 years, and they only have 1 chick. So it takes them 4 years to pay for themselves, if that makes sense, to an ecosystem. If they can raise 2 chicks up, for the mother and father have done their bit, and they've continued to have the population at a stable level. But that takes 4 years. And so, you have to have 2 vultures raising one chick. If one vulture dies, the chick dies, and the vulture has to go and find a new mate again. And so the reason that vulture population is declining so much is because the fact that they are slow breeders, and because they are so long lived, and they are so susceptible to human encroachment.
How are they susceptible to human encroachment?
So there's three main vulture population decline by 99% of the decline is due to humans.
99%
of the decline that's occurred is due to humans.
Bloody hell.
And there's three main factors that causes that decline. The first one is poisoning. 60% of vulture deaths over the last 3 generations have been due to poisonings. And there's three methods of poisoning that occur for this to occur. Mm-hmm. So the first two methods are indirect. So they're not deliberately being poisoned. Other things are trying to be poisoned, and they're having an effect by eating the food. So the first of those is farmers will go out and they'll lace poison on carcasses like cows to kill other predators, to kill lions, to kill jackals, to kill hyenas, to kill painted dogs. And they do it so that in order to keep their cattle alive, because predators are a massive threat to cattle. And vultures, because they're the cleanup crew, they come down and they try and eat the poison food, the poison carcasses, and they all die because they all get poisoned. Because they can't digest poison. Like they've got an incredibly strong digestive system, which means they can eat rotten flesh where other things can't, but they can't eat poison, so they all die. So that's the immediate poisoning from farmers. The second one is more chronic. So like if you put out pesticides all over your land for like countless years, over time that will bioaccumulate into species. And bioaccumulation is basically where a low level of pesticide is eaten from the grass into an antelope. It gets concentrated in the antelope. Then a lion, say, will come and eat all of those antelope, and the percentage of that poison will increase in the lion. Then the lion dies, and a vulture will come down and eat that lion because it's dead, and it will have a huge concentration of poison in its system, and that will poison the vultures and kill them. So that's all down to farmers using pesticides and herbicides and other stuff like that. So that's two of the poisoning things. And then the third poisoning thing, which I think is the most outrageous, and it actually ties into the article that we showed you about Africa Geographic, is deliberate poisonings. Vultures are a symbol for anti-poaching units to alert them that an elephant or a rhino has been poached nearby. Because they see a massive elephant carcass and they think, oh, fantastic, I'm going to go and eat this huge portion, this huge elephant, and be filled up for the rest of the month. And so they go out and they eat this elephant, and the poachers know this, and they want to get rid of the vultures because the vultures are signaling the anti-poaching units. So they will go out and they will deliberately poison elephant carcasses that they've already poached in order to get vultures to come down, eat the carcasses, and all die, so that they can't get affected. So they can't actually be used as
these warning signals.
Exactly, yeah.
So that poison is obviously fast acting then.
Extremely fast acting. It will kill them in a day. And like you can't unless you find this carcass, they will all be dead in a day. Like the vultures will die in that day. And the problem with this is the poison is so. I've been to Zimbabwe. I was there in January, right? The poison is sold on the street. It's illegal, but it's just sold on the street to people. People will actively go out and sell this poison openly on the streets, and people don't care, like because people don't know about it. And so they'll go out. Poachers will buy this poison, go out, kill their elephant, place it with all the poison, and then they'll take the tusks and go back, and then all the vultures are dead. It's outrageous what happens. And the way to fix that, of course, is to educate people about what's going on. You know, if a tourist sees a person with a big like offering him some sort of white substance, obviously it's not necessarily going to be drugs or anything, but like because that happens quite a lot as well in Zimbabwe. But you know, if they're just out on the side of the street looking fishy, got a big things of pockets of stuff, report it to the police, and then suddenly these people get taken in, and then that's what happens. Like the only way to get them set this, they know they're not going to get caught because no one cares about it, so they will openly sell it on the street. It's nuts.
So this is the people selling the poison.
Yeah. They're the suppliers. You target a supply chain rather than react to it, and you can get rid of it.
could you even go back? Is there an alternative farming method that wouldn't encourage animals to kill the livestock, which in turn...
So I need to be clear here. This is the poison by the poachers.
The poison.
This is not by the farmers. The farmers use all legal substances.
Yeah.
And they're allowed. In some cases in Africa, in some places they are allowed to go out and poison carcasses to kill lions or kill stuff like that if they're being problems. If they are registered as a problem animal, they're allowed to go and do that. But when I'm talking about this here, I'm talking about deliberate poisonings by poachers onto like elephant carcasses, and they sell the stuff in the street. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. Just sell it in the street.
It's absolutely nuts. And yeah, it's a big battle that people have got to fight. And that's one of the roles that conservation organizations for vultures are doing. They're educating people about these substances are being used for poisonings. Because like if a conservation truck drives along and sees a person selling some stuff and they know what it is, they can report it. Whereas if they don't know what it is, then they can't do anything about it, unfortunately. Anyway, so that's the first.
That's poison.
That's the first main poison thing, and that mainly occurs in southern and eastern Africa. The second thing, southern and eastern. So from South Africa to Kenya, all the way up that east coast, and across up to about Zambia-ish. And then the second worst thing for vulture populations, which is causing them to decline by 30%, is voodoo and medicine. People in West Africa particularly in their culture in West Africa, they view vultures as this sort of magical creature. If you can have vulture necks around your neck, you'll be a really potent man and stuff like that. And they actually go out and they sell and they buy they poach vultures to wear around their necks to be potent men. They also eat vulture meat because they think it's very, very nutritious and very, very if you eat the meat of a vulture, you'll be able to never be poisoned and stuff like that because they've got such strong stomachs, which is a bit ironic considering the vultures get poisoned all the time. And that's all in West Africa. I don't know too much about that and how to stop that, but I do know that Nigeria and Benin account for 95% of all the vulture trades in Africa.
What countries? Sorry?
Nigeria and Benin. So they're in West Africa.
Yeah.
So I think Nigeria is like 70% of all vulture trade happens in Nigeria, and 23% happens in Benin. And they'll have open street markets where they're just selling vultures and they're selling other exotic animals. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So that's that 30%, and then the last 9%, which is 1% is like their natural decline over time, which is due to like human erosion and stuff. But 9% of it is actually due to power lines. 9% of all vulture deaths are due to power lines because vultures, when they nest, they like nesting in high places away from predators so that no predators can come and eat their chicks. So historically, they would like nest in cliff faces where nothing could reach them. But suddenly, these brand new big sticks that nothing can climb pop out of nowhere, thinking, "Oh, it's a great place to nest my chick. I'm going to come and land here, build up a nest, raise my chick for a couple of times, fly in. Oh, I've got electrocuted, and I'm dead." And that's what happens to the vulture population. That's like 9%. 9% of deaths. It's crazy how much of the percentage of that decline is due to just them around power lines, around human power lines. And you can't fix that because people need power. So it's very, very difficult to work out how to stop that from happening. When that does happen, like there's a lot of organizations that are very reactive to that sort of thing. They're very big about their education. If you see a vulture nest, report it, and then we will monitor that vulture nest. And if something happens to the vultures on that power line, we will be able to go in straight away and then be able to heal it up and fix the vulture if we can. But it's all reactive. You can't do that proactively unless you get rid of power lines, and you can't do that unless you convert everyone to solar, which is really expensive. Yeah. So it's nuts.
Yeah, so there's got to be a problem that is probably not solvable, at least in the near future.
No.
Yeah. Okay, so we have poison, we have kind of voodoo medicine, kind of traditional medicine, and then we have the power lines.
Power lines, yeah. Those are the three main causes of vulture decline, and they've caused vulture decline by 62% on average across all species, but 5 species have declined by more than 80%. because of all this stuff. Like the
And
white-headed
you're
vulture,
attributing like a percentage to those things. So you said 9% to power lines, and what for the rest?
30% for the voodoo medicine and
Yeah.
60% for poisoning.
Poison.
And this all comes from a paper by Ogasha et al., I think his name is, which I can link you and I can link to your followers as well.
Yes. Link
I
me.
will absolutely send this. It was in 2016, and he did a systemic review of all vulture decline over the last, like going through every single paper that's ever been published on vultures and working out the declines and all the data. And so this came out 3 years ago. And so this is
so it's got population declines
like,
and those kind of statistics.
Yeah, it's got everything in it. It's got tables, graphs, pie charts, everything. Like, and it's the sort of thing, and you can, it's a way for people to get interested into science. Just to go back to getting people interested in science for a minute. It's, you can go onto Google on a thing called Google Scholar, and you can type in vulture decline review, and the first thing will come up will be Ogasha's paper, and you can click on it, and and there'll be like 10 versions of it, and one of those will be free, because scientific papers are not free. You have to buy them unless you're a student. But there's a lot of, across like the web, you can get the free version of the paper, and so you can actually read the paper. If people want to learn about lions, they can type in lion behavior review, lion conservation review, and things will come up. And so they can go out and read these scientific papers, because that's how I got into the science, proper science side of things. That's
Google
what
Scholar.
I did. Yeah, literally just Google Scholar. You can go on Google Scholar, type in a species name of a particular topic, and about 2 million papers will pop up, and you'll click the first couple, and that'll be it.
Mm-hmm.
It's that easy now.
Yeah. Google Scholar's a great tool. One thing I'm quite interested in at the moment is I feel like the population decline is a good fact to kind of present as like an infographic or something, because it's very visual and it's very black and white. It's like, this was the population 50 years ago and this is the population now, and people can see the drastic decline. But it's not always easy trying to find that information. So what are some, like, with vultures, with animals and the population decline, what keywords would you use in Google Scholar? This is kind of more from my personal interest.
You don't have to use Google Scholar to get population declines. The best thing to do that is to go onto the IUCN website, the IUCN Red List, which is where the majority of the stuff on declines comes from, because they're all like the Ogasha name I mentioned before. He did the Red List for all these species. So the way that the Red List works is you've got a species, it goes through all the data on their population ever, and it works out a population decline, and then works out whether or not they're endangered or critically endangered or vulnerable or least concern, any of the factors. And all you need to do is type in IUCNRedList.org or whatever it is, or you just need to Google IUCN Red List, and it comes up, and you've got a search bar, type in a species, and it will come up with that species, and then you download the assessment, and it's there. And you've got a 10-page document which details everything about that population status in the world today.
Yeah, but does that include kind of like historic data as well?
Yeah, it includes everything. It includes where the population was 3 generations ago, how it's declined, how much it's declined by now. A lot of the species that are very well known, they've got extra supplementary material where they'll have like actual, like for instance, the painted dog, which is a good example that I use. It's got each population today, and each population 30 years ago, and what the differences are between that. So it goes, and that's because the painted dog has got lots of research funding behind it, and loads of people are researching it all across Africa. So you can go and do that. People aren't researching vultures that much, so you can't really get that historical data. Same with like a lot of bird species, you don't really get the same level of accuracy. But they've got a very good way of modeling how this decline has occurred and what the likelihood of decline is. And so it is the best tool, I think, to understand how species are declining, are to go onto the IUCN website and then you can take their data and then create infographics from it. And that's the way you cite them in your infographic saying this data is from IUCN Red List, but you can then spread that information to as many people as possible in a very digestible way as possible.
Yeah, it's all about making it digestible, isn't it?
It is.
Reading a scientific research paper and then trying to figure out how we can package it in a way that's we can post on social media, and you even need to be more specific than that, because a piece of content, what that looks like should be different on Instagram. It will look different on YouTube. It will look different on Facebook. It will look different on Twitter. Like, you can't just create one video and then just post it on each of those platforms. You need to tweak it a little bit to suit that platform and how people consume that content on that platform. So like, even on Instagram, vertical videos do better than non-vertical videos, just because it takes more real estate up on the screen. So just from the perspective of attention spans, again, when you scroll down your feed, it will appear on the screen for longer, therefore we'll pay more attention to it. So these little nuances I find fascinating.
You have to tailor it to the platform, exactly.
You need to respect the platform, and you need to respect the people that consume on that platform and what they want to see on that platform.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's a crazy world.
And like, our job as scientists and scientific literate people, and people who understand, like conservationists who aren't scientists because they haven't got the degree but understand the science. Our job is to spread as much of this information as possible on all these platforms in a digestible way, to get the average person who's not into their conservation to think, oh, that's quite interesting, I'll click on that and learn something new, and then maybe I'll get into it, as we've said before. And so the best thing to do for that, if you, like, for instance, if you want to create infographics about a new species and you don't want to have to rely on experts, you go on the IUCN website and you get a particular species that you're interested in, and you read their 10-page document, you pick out the really important parts of that you think are important, create an infographic out of it, and suddenly 8,000 people can get this condensed information and learn a lot about a species.
Yeah, I think that's very important. That's a big reason why I started this podcast. Like, my Earth Offline project's not where I want it to be, but the podcast is a big step in getting where I want to be, because my whole content strategy, which I'm currently working on, involves a podcast. So a pillar piece of content which goes for, say, an hour, and then from that, and it's documenting. So I'm not creating I'm not creating this podcast. I'm just documenting. So that in itself saves me time, but still useful. From that podcast, I can extract small videos. I can extract images. I can extract infographics. I can extract photos. I can extract potentially 100 pieces of content, which I could repurpose to each social platform. And that all comes from, I'm not creating each content. I'm just extracting it from my podcast. So, like, once I figure that out, I'm hoping I can eventually be in a place where I can do a podcast a week, and from that I can create fairly quickly 100 good pieces of content which I can post to all these social platforms. And I want to be able to fine tune that system so I can roll that out weekly. So I think volume is important as well. Quality is obviously important, but the ideal combination is quality and quantity. And the podcast is an integral part of allowing yourself to create quality content at scale. So that's something that I'm working through at the moment, is trying to figure out, like, turning 1 minute of this into a video meme on Instagram, for example. Stuff like this. It's all experimental at the moment for me, but it's trying to figure out how I can harness the social media which people are living on. That in itself is like the online offline world. We live on the online world. The offline world is...
I genuinely hate it. I genuinely hate how addicted everyone is to their online stuff. I wanted to delete Facebook, actually, but I couldn't because of the fact that I need to reach out to people and talk about conservation and spread that. So I like Facebook is such an important, integral part of the conservation world to share information. And it's not just for the Zoocan stuff I do, but it's for everything. I need to learn as much as I can through that. But then it's the other side of it. It's just it overtakes everything that you do unless you're careful about it. And
for sure. Yeah, like I'm not big on social media. Like before this, like I had a Facebook account, but I never used it. I had an Instagram account, but I never used it. The only reason why I'm doing this is because of conservation. And the same with podcasts. Like I hate being on camera. Like I despise being on camera. Like
why is that?
Well, I just
like,
I don't like being center of attention. That's like my ideal scenario would be inspiring conservation and no one knowing who I am. But I know,
yeah. And you'd like to be an underlying organization who does all the stuff behind the scenes, effectively. Yeah.
Yeah.
In a very similar, like analogous to the stuff that goes on in conservation these days. You got the big names. You're always on the documentaries and stuff. Like Attenborough's always on the documentaries. Chris Packham, who's in the UK. And then you have really small conservation organisations who are not in the limelight, working their butts off, and not getting credit for it, but also not wanting to get credit for it. They're doing it because they want to do as much as they can for conserving of the areas.
But I realize that it's important to spread this message, and a good way to spread that message is on social media and through a podcast. Yeah. So, I'm just doing it, biting the bullet and doing it and just learning as I go. But I do enjoy the conversations on these podcasts. I'm I'm that bloke that would go to a party and would kind of sit down to someone and be like, so what do you think the meaning of life is? Like, I'll go.
What are your 3 passions about life is a good one that I like to say.
I pretty much jump to those like deep questions, and they either like it or they don't. And if they don't, I move on. But so this kind of format is good for me.
I'll be like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
I love to be able to do have you know what a DNM is? Hey, do you have that phrase in UK?
DNM.
Deep and meaningful. Deep and meaningful.
Yeah.
I'd love to have a DNM about conservation every week. That'd be freaking great. But yeah, very, very fascinating. So, so you touched on the threats. What are some potential conservation solutions that have been proposed at the moment?
Well, to stop poisonings of vultures, which is the main conservation threat in southern Africa, you've got to do 3 things. You've got to stop elephant poaching and stop rhino poaching, because those are the carcasses that are getting poisoned. So in order to do that by stopping the poaching of elephants and rhinos, you indirectly save the vulture population.
Yeah.
So, but obviously that's not going as fast as everyone needs it to. So investing much more time and money and effort into that. And then education for farmers, like farmers, using pesticides and herbicides that won't bioaccumulate. Because nowadays, pesticides and herbicides are being invented, especially in the West, that are much less damaging to the environment than they used to be. So educating farmers to use those, but again, they've got to be financially viable. You can't just say you've got to use something that is really good for the environment if it costs them 500% more to use. Yeah. So you've got to find a solution to do that. So you got to get farmers to use affordable herbicides and pesticides that are good for the environment effectively, and you've got to get them to be much more tolerant of predators on their property. The way to do that is to get them to fence much higher for lions to get in, prevent lions getting in. And then in terms of farmers, like for other predators, painted dogs and jackals don't really go for and cheetahs as well. Cheetahs is a big one. They don't actually really go for livestock, but they're perceived to. So it's educating them about the fact by showing them actual data that they're not actually going to be attacking your livestock. And then they're much more lenient on those particular predators. So stop the farmers by poisoning cattle, poisoning their own cattle to do predators, making the farmers use much more environmentally sustainable but also financially sustainable alternatives to their herbicides and pesticides, and prevent elephant and rhino poaching. And those 3 things will cause the decline of vultures in southern Africa to effectively halt if you can solve those 3 problems. In Western Africa, much more difficult because they are taken primarily for voodoo and for medicine. So you've got that's education again, saying they're not actually beneficial, but it is their culture. They've been doing it for thousands of years, and some Westerner comes in and says you can't kill vultures because they don't do anything, isn't going to work. So you've got to actually work out a means of explaining to them in a positive way, you know, getting them to understand that the importance of vultures to an environment, but then not hindering on their beliefs or making fun of their beliefs effectively, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that must be a tricky situation.
Extremely tricky. Yeah.
Yeah, because obviously it comes down to education, but especially with the older people in that community, I imagine it would be very difficult to convince them otherwise. You know, you reach a period in your life where it becomes your beliefs aren't as malleable as they were when you're younger. So it's hard to convince the older person about, you know, you shouldn't do this versus the younger one. So if it is the case that the younger ones can be convinced, then it's probably going to be the next generation where you'll see the reduction, perhaps.
Exactly. You've also got to remember as well that vultures are extremely wide-ranging species. A lappet-faced vulture, for instance, or a white-backed vulture can have a meal. There was a paper that was published 2 years ago, I think it was. It was collared in Tanzania. So when I say collared, what they do is they have these really, really, really lightweight radio trackers that they track the vultures and put them on the back of their backs. They are solar powered and they don't actually really hinder the vulture at all, because it weighs almost nothing. And so they put it on this vulture in the middle of Tanzania, and they tracked this vulture and it went all the way down to the bottom of South Africa. It traveled about like 7,000 miles or something ridiculous, that far. And that's how far wide they range. So it's a continent-wide problem that has to be solved. And so if a vulture, it's just to understand the scale of the problem. If vulture conservation is doing really well in South Africa, you know, they get rid of all their elephant poaching, they get rid of their rhino poaching, which they're not doing, but they will do eventually. They can really conserve them really well in South Africa. But then that vulture can fly to Malawi or to northern Zambia and then eat a poisoned carcass and then get killed. So because that's how far wide they range. So you've got to have conservation and all of these methods that I've talked about implemented across all of Africa. And that's very difficult to do when these countries are very, very poor, effectively. Like the people in Zambia, for instance, whilst it's quite a effectively rich country, they in terms of the rest of the region, the farmers there are the environmental regulation is extremely very unregulated. Yeah. So like the farmers don't really care about the fact that they're putting out, they don't really care about the fact they're putting out DDT, and which is, DDT is still being used in Tanzania and Zambia, which is crazy, I think. But they don't really care that they're doing that because they're still getting good crop yields. Mm-hmm. So you have to explain to them that not using these, it's very difficult to explain to them. You have to explain to them that using like these old methods of herbicides and pesticides are going to be detrimental to you further on. Because if you wipe out, the way to do it is say, if you wipe out vultures, then all these carcasses are going to be everywhere. Stray dog populations are going to massively increase, are going to be looking for cattle and looking for things to eat. So they're going to attack your sheep and attack your cattle. If you have massive packs of dogs everywhere, that's actually that's what happened in India in the early 2000s. India population of vultures declined by 98% in 5 years in the early 2000s.
In India,
and that's because they found out it's because of a drug called diclofenac, which was implemented into cattle, and all these cattle were eating this diclofenac, and they would be fine because it was a medicine for them. But then vultures would eat the dead cattle, and they all died, and they all died, and then dog population skyrocketed, stray dog population skyrocketed, and now India has one of the highest rates of rabies in the world because of the fact that vultures were wiped out.
And how did the vultures affect the dog population?
Because there's dead cattle. There's loads of dead cattle not being broken down.
Yeah.
Then, like, if they get killed by tigers or get killed by bears and stuff, and wolves and things like that, and leopards, and then the cattle die, and then the vultures eat the cattle, all get poisoned by this diclofenac because they can't digest it, all die. Then there's meat everywhere, and so stray dogs come and eat the meat, and then their population explodes because there's loads of free meat everywhere.
Yeah.
And then those dogs then go into communities and infect people with rabies, so they bite them. And so that's why the rabies outbreaks in India have increased exponentially since the vulture crisis.
And when was that?
That was in the early 2000s. It was known as the Indian vulture crisis, and that's going to happen in Africa if these things go extinct. Like that will happen again because the fact that the Africa is much larger continent. There are many, many more stray dogs compared to India. So the populations, and there's also much more wildlife in Africa as well. So if ecosystems break down and there's loads of dead animals everywhere, stray dogs will go into normal wildlife areas and eat loads of dead meat, and then it'll just explode as well. And so that will affect wild populations in Africa, but also affect all the communities as well. So you'll get huge disease outbreaks.
So that's kind of where we're heading
That's where we're heading if we don't sort it out. And we can sort it out if we act now, effectively. Mm-hmm. But we have to do it. It has to be a continent-wide, effectively, which is very difficult. Obviously, getting every single country to implement these policies, a broad scale, is incredibly difficult. But it's definitely possible.
So how can we help as the general public?
Well, how can the general public help? If it all depends on whether or not you're willing to go to Africa or not. So if you can't make the journey, either because you can't afford it or you just it's never really appealed to you, you can still help by educating people about the crisis, learning about it and then educating, and also by donating to several several conservation organizations. Mm-hmm. But the best way to help is actually to go to Africa and experience Africa, support the African people and then support the conservation in those areas. Because the majority of funding that comes from a lot of conservation areas is actually via tourism. Because ecotourism, whilst it has some flaws, it's actually much more positive overall. And every single ecotourist will pay a levy towards conservation in that particular area. Mm-hmm. So by going on safari or even if it's a really cheap safari, effectively, you'll be contributing to the conservation of that species, of the entire areas.
So what are your thoughts on ecotourism? Like, I personally think it has massive potential for two reasons. One, you kind of develop that emotional connection with the natural world, with animals. Like, you can never replace a tangible real world experience with, say, a video. It's just not the same. And the second reason is ecotourism gives the natural world a monetary value, which is important for the decision makers of the world. So I'm a big believer in it, but like you said, there's obviously flaws to the system, and there's things that we can improve on. But what are your thoughts on it as a conservational tool?
I think it definitely has its place, and it is like ecotourism, if it's done properly, is in terms of if it's well regulated. If you put in 30 lodges into a particular area just to get as much money out of it as possible, I don't agree with that. But if it's well regulated and it's and you have a right amount of lodges and a right amount of money going into an area, it's actually extremely beneficial to that area. The problem is ecotourism is only viable in certain areas. So areas that are close to airports, areas that have got very beautiful areas of wildlife, like beautiful scenery, huge densities of game. So then how do you protect the other areas? So ecotourism does their great job of, as you said, it provides a monetary value to the species, and you experience an environment where you couldn't exactly see. You can't, as you said, you can't compare a video to the real deal. But then how would you protect all the other wildlife areas that currently exist in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, in Botswana without ecotourism? Because that's essentially what you have to do. Mm-hmm. Now, the current method of doing that is actually hunting. So you've got huge the huge pockets of ecotourism money, which are in different areas. So say in Zimbabwe, Mana Pools, Zambezi National Park and Wanga National Park are the three largest areas for ecotourism. And then in between all of those, you've got hunting concessions, which actually operate as wildlife corridors in between the areas. So animals can move freely in inverted commas, because they can still get shot by people, but hypothetically they can move across huge areas of land and have protected habitat.
So you're proposing that as a potential solution to ensure that the money is distributed more evenly throughout.
It's not a solution that I am morally happy with, but it is currently in place, and it's actually, when done right, is actually quite beneficial to the areas. Well, the way I look at it is, why does an elephant's life matter more than 1,000 kudus, 1,000 impalas, 10 million insects? Why is one animal's life more important than everything else's?
I think the question would be, is it necessary to kill that elephant in order to save those?
Yeah.
Can you save those through an alternative method?
Well, that's the thing, right? In these particular areas, people don't go to them. So people aren't going to go on a photo safari to an area that's not very pretty and doesn't have a high proportion of game. Mm-hmm. So an elephant hunt, I'd never do it. I think it's abhorrent. Because elephants are so socially advanced, the way that I could never ever do it. But if you shoot an elephant in Zimbabwe, you get $50,000, of which a proportion of that will go into conserving the area. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a trade-off. And the good thing about it is, I would say good thing, is that because these areas currently exist, they can then later on, when people are more interested in conservation and more willing to go out to Africa and experience it, they can then be converted to ecotourism reserves, which is actually what's happened in Mana Pools, around Mana Pools. So Mana Pools is the site of where the BBC shot Dynasties for their Painted Wolves documentary. And in Mana Pools, they've got this one area of Mana Pools is shown, and they say it's all Mana Pools, but only the centre of the actual map they show is Mana Pools, and the rest of it on either side is hunting concession. And one of those hunting concessions was a hunting concession for 30, 40 years, I think it was. And now it's been bought out by a conservation trust and is purely for conservation and ecotourism. And because that hunting concession existed, now that wildlife area is existing where the animals are not hunted at all and they're completely protected by the conservation trusts that operate there. So I would like to see over time a phasing out of the hunting, but currently in the state that we've got at the moment, it's actually quite an important thing to have in Africa in order to conserve areas of conservation.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way, I guess, moving forward for there to be some kind of almost like a ecosystem tax where all these privatized ecotourism organizations would have to give off an X amount of their profit into a pool of money, which would then be distributed?
That happens already for all of the lodges. They all have to pay. Like, for instance, if I wanted to go on safari in Zambia, which is, I know this, so I know the figures. So I wanted to go, it's the Lower Zambezi National Park. I could go to Lower Zambezi National Park for $1,000 a night, of which $200 of those dollars would be a conservation levy that goes towards, effectively a conservation tax that goes towards the wildlife area. Mm. And it's not just that one wildlife area, but all the wildlife areas around that Lower Zambezi National Park as well. Mm-hmm. Mm. But what I think you're saying is a conservation tax where you increase like the percentage of the money that you put forward, and that gets taxed and then goes to other wildlife areas that are
may receive less ecotourism or
exactly
something.
Yeah. So that is also, but then that's offloading the prices onto the consumer. People are less likely. I know that people are less likely to go on holiday if it costs them $500 a night extra. So.
But do you reckon
the way
it would be $500
the organisations will do it? It depends how much you want to conserve. It could be it could be like for instance, in the Timbavati, they raised their conservation levy to about $40. Timbavati is a game reserve in Southern Africa. They raised their conservation levy by $40 in 1 year. So if that continues to happen over successive years, mm-hmm. It could be that much money. But I think 500 is a bit steep. I think though. I think if I said something more like $100, people are less likely to do that. If it's a family of 4, say, and they've got to they're spending 6 nights on a safari, because that's what normally happens, and it's $400 extra a night. So that's $2,500 more. They're less likely to go to that particular place. Mm-hmm. So it's a thing that can definitely be brought in, but only if everyone does it. Because if everyone does it, then the prices of safaris go up across the board, and like people will just, they'll just do it anyway because they still want to go on safari.
Yeah, but then if the supply also, if the demand increases as well, then the price, like if more people go, then the price will decrease as well. And I think would attract tourists if they realize that them being there means that less elephants are going to be shot through trophy hunting, then there's more of an incentive to go there in the first place. So I know many that can afford it would do it purely on that reason that they, by going there, they're stopping this.
A good example of that is Botswana. Botswana banned hunting in 2014, and they saw a huge increase in ecotourism because of it, because people didn't want animals to get shot.
Yeah.
But this incident of the elephants being poached and those 500 vultures dying occurred in one of those old hunting concessions that nothing's been done with it. Mm-hmm. Like in 6 years, no one has taken over that hunting concession for ecotourism. No money has been put into it, and so there's no real conservation organisation on the ground. As in the funding is just not there for it. So that's why these elephants are more likely to have gotten poached, and then that's going to exacerbate things. So the way to do that, what Botswana should have done, is when they had their ecotourism boom in 2015, 2016, is opened up more of their conservation areas that were hunting concessions and converted them to ecotourism. But they didn't do that because they didn't plan that far ahead, unfortunately. Because ultimately, the hunting ban that came in by the Khan administration was an executive order. Mm-hmm. So the president just signed a thing saying no more hunting. We're banning all hunting. And that was, over the last 6 years, the actual wildlife enroachment, like from people in the hunting concessions, has increased quite a lot. So it's a very tricky one, because I do agree with the policy, as long as you have a solution, like to implement after it, which they unfortunately didn't do very well. They did it around the main around the main wildlife areas, Moremi Game Reserve, Chobe National Park. They had those hunting concessions around that were then sold to ecotourism lodges, and that boomed. Those wildlife areas are really well protected, but the area next to the Makadikali Pans, that is between there and Wangi, isn't really used that much because it's hard to get to. So no one, and it's just flat land. So no one, and it's very, very flat deserty land, and no one really wants to go on safari there because they'd rather go to the Chobe River and see stuff, see huge densities of game. Apart from, obviously, there's the avid safari goers who go to this place just to experience it and be all on their own. Where was I? Yeah, so because they didn't organise that hunting concession and convert it to ecotourism straight away and promote it, having that promotion, that could be a factor in why we've seen a huge spike in elephant poaching over the last 5 years.
Because those areas weren't converted to ecotourism.
Yeah, effectively, yes. They weren't converted to ecotourism. The money dried up, and they just didn't do. They didn't really plan ahead for it, unfortunately. And so you might have seen the Elephant Without Borders report about elephant poaching. Elephant poaching in Botswana has increased by 500% over the last 5 years. And if you look at the map of where because they published their map, all of the elephants that have been poached, apart from about 5 or 6, I think it was, occurred either on the boundary between villages and the old hunting concessions, or in the old hunting concessions. So it's apart from obviously the ones where they had the new ecotourism areas. I'm talking about the old hunting concessions that are now derelict and don't have anyone managing them. That's where the increases in poaching are occurring. So the Botswana government's now solution is to bring back hunting and put money into that. My solution would be, why don't you just promote more ecotourism into those areas? Get people to go and visit them, and then get more money pumped into them. Or, as you said, get a conservation tax for all the current existing areas that have ecotourism lodges, and then pump that money into those old concession areas.
Well, like a combination of both. So promoting more land for ecotourism, and then imposing some kind of conservation tax where you can distribute that money more evenly across the board.
Exactly.
Yeah, like I can see the monetary justification for trophy hunting and how that money can be used to promote conservation, but it's more the morality aspect, and doesn't really make too sense to me. This idea of, there may be an influx of elephants or whatever in a certain area, and that's being detrimental to the balance of the ecosystem. Therefore, we should kill off a few of them in order to kind of return that number back to an optimal number. And then the money generated from the hunting can be used for conservation, but that doesn't really sit too well with me ethically.
Well, the issue that you just said there, you've equated, you basically said that you can get hunting to come in to control the elephant population. If it gets too many, then you can hunt some of them, and then you don't, then you can reduce the numbers. Effectively, what you just said. That's not the way. That's not what happens in Africa. Like, elephant populations are not controlled by hunting, because there's 126,000 elephants in Botswana, and before the hunting ban was put in place, only 400 was shot every year, roughly, that the permits are actually implemented. That was for actual hunts. The thing is that the way these organized, like the wildlife areas, control elephant populations is by widespread culling. In the same way that deer are culled in the UK and in the US. I don't know about the Australia and New Zealand, but across the board, like, animals are if there's too many of them, they just get wiped out by governments. Mm-hmm. And so people don't see that side of Africa too much. Well, not unfortunately, but it gives people a romanticized view of it. If you have an area, especially in South Africa, where it's all fenced in and they've got nowhere to go, like, I was in a place called Karongwe in South Africa last summer, and they routinely cull impalas like crazy, because impalas breed like crazy, and so they've got nowhere to go. So they have to be, every year they just shoot loads of them. They're not being trophy shot; they're just being shot to reduce the numbers. And that's what used to happen in the Kruger. It used to happen all across Southern Africa. Elephants used to be culled like crazy to control numbers, to protect the ecosystems. And then people were saying, I don't like elephants being culled, it's horrible, it's abhorrent, which it is. It absolutely is. So no longer, the Kruger doesn't cull anymore, Botswana doesn't cull anymore, and Zimbabwe doesn't really cull anymore either. And that's why the elephant populations are so high in those countries, in those three countries. You've got a population of elephants that is almost half the remaining population of elephants in the world in these three countries. And they're existing in habitat that can't support them as well as there's not enough habitat for them. So they're now, all the elephants that are in Botswana and Zimbabwe are encroaching on the existing communities around those areas. And so the reason Botswana also tried to bring back hunting as well is because that they asked the communities, what do you want done about these elephant populations? And the community said, we want you guys to go out and shoot them for meat, and then stop them from eating our crops. And so that's what the Botswana government's planning to do. And everyone is saying, outside of Botswana, is saying how abhorrent it is they're bringing back hunting. Well, in reality, they're doing it because the communities want people to go out and shoot elephants because they're destroying their crops, which is quite sad, really. It's quite again. You've got to think about conservation on the broad scale, but also on the local scale. Like elephants in Botswana, elephants in Zimbabwe, in these particular two areas, are at such high density. They're at high densities compared to everywhere else in Africa. And it is the last real remaining core population that is really strong. Now, you've got areas like Tanzania where the elephant population has declined by 100,000 in 10 years. So that in those areas, like, I can completely understand.
100,000 in 10 years.
100,000 elephants died in Tanzania in 10 years. All poached for ivory.
Is that on the Red List website as well?
That was published in The Guardian a few years ago, and I've got people on the ground who've told me, from Tanzania, who've told me it's about that figure. So I can try and source that figure.
Yeah, if you can send me a link or whatever to that figure. It's also
in I think it was by Dr. Chase, who's from Botswana, organised an elephant. He organised an elephant-wide. It was called the Great Elephant Census in 2014. Him and his team went out across all of Africa and measured elephant populations on their decline, which I'll send you. But yeah, Tanzania lost its elephant population effectively, by 80% in 10 years.
And what was that? Was that through poaching?
That was all through poaching, yeah.
Yeah.
So elephants in Tanzania are critically endangered, but elephants in Botswana are least concern. If that makes sense, they're not being poached as much, but they're still being. As I said before, they've been poached by an increase of 500%. But that's only from 18 individuals to 90 in 1 year, whereas in Tanzania they've lost 100,000. So it's all relative. So if Botswana nips its elephant poaching in the bud, if it completely stops its elephant poaching, which it will now do, it will then. I think the people who are living in the adjacent communities almost have the right to get something done about the elephants and then encroach on their land.
Yeah, it definitely makes it a lot more complex when the community themselves want it a particular way, because, like you said, it's a big. You need to approach conservation from the big perspective, and the local community is integral to that solution. And if they're wanting to kill them for their meat or kill them because they are destroying their crops, then you need to consider that, because they're the ones that are living there with them. But yeah, it is tricky, morally, ethically, but you also need to be practical as well, and balancing all of those things, and what does that look like is a hard one to kind of visualize.
But that's what conservation is all about. It's really, really complex situations that require really complex solutions, effectively. And the view of the Western world, if I put it in inverted commas, is nowadays, because with the rise of social media, like everyone knows everything now. You can learn about like this vulture thing that I've discovered.
We know
about
everything and nothing.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a good point. But we can understand, we can see things that go on. So if we people know that Botswana is going to bring back its hunting and are absolutely going nuts about it on all the conservation pages, and that can change policy. Just the views of people from the other side of the world saying, I'm not going to go to Botswana, and because they're now bringing back hunting, so if people saying that enough can change policy.
Yeah.
And that's that is what, like, for instance, a good example of this, it's not to do with hunting, it's completely different, but it's conservation based, is the in Zambia they were planning to dam up the Luangwa River.
Mm-hmm.
Now the Luangwa is the North Luangwa, South Luangwa, Luambe national parks and all the concessions around it cover about, I think it's 25,000 square k's, and if they dam this river, then they would have created a 2,500 square k lake which is 10% of the entire reserve. And through lobbying and by like WWF and ZCP, which are two organizations there, and through a social media campaign, they got 200,000 people to sign a petition to prevent the dam from happening.
Mm-hmm.
And people will sign it. And just today, the government have come out and said, we're no longer going to put the dam in the river. And it's all from people elsewhere signing and getting involved with this conservation and saying, we don't want this to happen because it's going to really impact the wildlife there. Like the international aspect and the national aspect, like intertwined almost, and have created and have all influenced this policy by a government in Africa, which I think is incredible.
Yeah, I think that's super incredible. Just goes to show the power of the internet. Like I believe in the power of the people, and the internet has the ability to harness the power of the people within an instant, effectively. But then the issue then becomes, if the people have that much power, we need to do the best to ensure that they're acting with an educated and informed way. You know, like these issues on conservation, which are very, life and death situations, we need to be sure that the people are equipped with the right knowledge to be making these decisions.
Exactly.
Which is difficult, and fake news is one thing that I'm trying to wrap my head around, because even with these infographics, you see these images and these articles, and there is no way of knowing instantly how reputable it is and if it's fake news or if it's legit. Like it is difficult. So that's like when we did our Trivia Tuesday the other night, just having the sources at the end.
Yeah.
I want to try like in previous infographics, I've cited, where I've got the information from, and I wish Instagram would allow us to link actual URLs in the caption so people can actually click and go to the article, because that's a good way to just be like, this seems crazy. Let me just check if it's real. Like, is there a link somewhere where I can click and just fact check? But we don't have that option on Instagram, unfortunately.
Well, I would actually disagree with that, because you can put a link in your bio. So
and then you can link them back to your.
So you can say,
link
here's at the end of like your your Trivia Tuesday, you say, here are our sources, links in my bio, and they can go and click on those papers and they can read them.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
That might be worth trying to do next time or something like that for your papers and stuff.
Yeah, because I'm using Linktree at the moment, which allows you to have like multiple different links under the one link.
Like your stuff about fake news is very, very relevant for Botswana in this hunting stuff, because Mike Chase, who's the head of Elephant Without Borders, he was the one who published this stuff. Poaching has increased by 500% over the last 5 years in Botswana, and that's all from his data that he's collected and that he's published and made public. And the Botswanan government accused him of spreading false information about Botswana's wildlife situation, and they revoked his research permits completely, because they said he was spreading fake news about the country. And so Botswana is actually creating fake news by saying that fake news was being done, like Mike Chase was saying fake news, if that makes sense. They were trying to underplay the situation deliberately, and they've said that because he was spreading fake news even though he wasn't, he's no longer allowed to do research in Botswana for particular parts of his organization.
You're right.
Which is nuts. But that's not another big thing about conservation is the politics. You've got to be so careful about when you're interacting about how who you're working with and their views. If it's like, because you in conservation, you are working with government officials. If you do anything to disrespect the government official, you can lose everything like that. You can lose, and then suddenly 10 years of your work has gone down the drain. It's quite nuts, really, how political it all is. And so, but then overall, I think it's really worth it. So I think all of that stuff, like, the politics aside, is just being able to go out and work in the bush and conduct research and conserve species, and then spread that knowledge to people about the work that you do, makes it so much more worth it. And the difference that you make makes it so much more worth it than just not doing anything at all. So
yeah, that's one thing I want to do, is kind of get some more hands-on experience. Because obviously being an architect, and practicing for a couple of years after graduating, and then starting this project only about a year ago, and this is still evolving, and I'm still trying to figure out what this all means. But I want to get some tangible hands-on experience, and maybe somewhere in Africa, some volunteering somewhere in Africa, or even looking at maybe Sumatra with some orangutans there.
You've got to be extremely careful with volunteer organisations, because volunteer organisations there are so many of them, and you've got to do so much research, as in your own research, on the organisations themselves, because there are so many volunteer organisations out there that say they're for conservation and they're not. They're just money-making machines, and they do so little for the conservation communities around them. It's really quite abhorrent.
Is there like a TripAdvisor specific to conservation where they review these organizations? Like, is there a platform where, or like a website you can go to?
Like, for example, there's a Facebook group called Volunteers in Africa Beware, and it lists like 300 organizations in a very good, bad, ugly list of where to go. And that's a good baseline to start off with. But then once you've, like, there's a bit of a discrepancy, because some of the ones that are on the good list aren't necessarily supposed to be on the good list. It's just there's a bit of favoritism going on by the actual the page organizers, which always, like, there's like, for instance, there's a bloke called Kevin Richardson. Yeah, there's a bloke called Kevin Richardson in South Africa who has a lion sanctuary in inverted commas, and he's on the good list. But he plays with his lions, and like he does his. You have to be a lion sanctuary. You can't breed lions, and you have to be accredited by the sanctuary organization of South Africa, whatever it's called. And his is not. But he gets loads of volunteers to come and see his lions, him interact with his lions, and they're on the good list. That what he is part of.
What's his name?
Kevin Richardson.
Oh, so he's not good. I've seen him.
Yeah,
he
you've
hacks
seen
his
his
lines
stuff.
and stuff.
I wouldn't say he's not good, because he is he has got so many people interested in conservation, because he's but on the other hand, he does exploit the animals that he's got. So it's a tricky situation, that one, I would say. He doesn't mean to exploit them. It's just he genuinely loves his animals, and like he wants them to have the best lives that they possibly could have.
Mm-hmm.
But he does go out and play with them all the time, and it makes people think, oh, that's cool. I want to go out and play with a lion. I'm going to go volunteer somewhere. I want to go and play with a lion.
Or I'll buy one as a pet, whether it's lions or chimpanzees.
So that's a big problem for cheetahs and lions and leopards in the Middle East. Is the wildlife trade for pets is so tough to try and sort out, that because it's a cultural thing. If you've got a lion, you've got a cheetah, you are so much higher in the social status, and that's another area of conservation that is very tricky.
That's something I've been trying to look for some research papers on, because there's a lot of animal influencers out there at the moment, which, like, I genuinely believe their intentions are great. Like they love the animals and they care for the animals, but they're also hugging these animals and they're being in such unnatural environments. Like the chimpanzee might be in a bathtub and he's like helping him shampoo his hair or something, and this is part of a sanctuary, but these people have millions and millions of views, and even though their intention may be admirable, that doesn't translate to the people viewing it necessarily. All they see is, this looks cool, I want one for myself. Like I read through the comments and one's like, oh, I want a pet like that. Well, that's my dream. That's my dream pet.
Have you seen the Instagram page Black Jaguar White Tiger?
Yeah.
Like it's that sort of stuff. You know, every single video he's got is him with like 6 lion cubs in his house. And I'm like, you know, you're a sanctuary, but how have you always got baby cubs? You know, you've got all these famous people coming. You got like Ryan Seacrest coming and viewing your animals and thinking, oh, this is fantastic. And you get millions of views. And I can understand, like he generally said he first started off because he wanted to rescue animals from zoos.
Yeah.
And not zoos, from circuses in Mexico. And so that's how he started off. But now, because he's so big and popular, he's fueling that trade. He's fueling people to go and breed cubs so that people like him and people like him will go and buy them and save them. Like that's one of the flaws, I think, of social media, is that the wrong information gets spread too easily.
Well, I don't think it's the social media isn't the issue. It's that we just need to be more responsible with how we consume content. Like I was mentioning before, intention and perception don't always align. And this Black Jaguar guy, I don't know the bloke, but his intentions could be good. Like in his brain, he might be like, "This, I'm doing the right thing, and this is good for conservation." But that's not how that content's perceived by a lot of people. So I think there needs to be more responsibility on the consumer about looking at a content and just trying to learn more about it before you kind of judge it. You know, like, this doesn't look right. Why doesn't it look right? Let me just research it a little bit. Because, I don't think it's Instagram's fault. Like, Instagram's just a mirror. Like, Instagram isn't posting content just on itself. It's posting what we want it to post. So all these things that we're thinking, it's just exposing our good and bad traits. And I don't think that is necessarily a good or bad thing. It's just the reality. And if it's a bad thing, then it gives us the opportunity to address it. Like, if that makes sense. Like, it's just exposing our good and bad traits, which is probably a good thing, because we can reinforce the good traits and then try and counter the bad traits that are exposed through these platforms.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but it's extremely difficult to counter a bad trait of a page that's got 7 million likes, and it gets and people like it's reached out to 7 million people or 8 million people, whatever it is. I don't know. And I'm only using Black Jaguar, White Tiger as an example, but there are loads of them.
Oh like there are loads.
Like, I'm only using that name because everyone else, people who are watching this, will know what that organization is. But like that. You've got, again, as you say, you've got to be more responsible about and more thought-provoking about what you're actually viewing.
Yeah.
But then the average person who doesn't know anything about conservation sees these things because they're cute animals, and they think, oh, that's cool. They don't. A lot of people aren't interested in going out and learning this stuff because they're just happy following these cute animal pages on their Instagrams and stuff, and it's a very difficult one to change. But you ultimately got to change people's perceptions. It all comes back to, again, us saying at the start of this, you've got to change people's view on something, but then make them want to change their view and like get something good out of it.